The prince's love or the king's command, the ruler of the UAE, King Mohammed, was not just a monarch but the ultimate authority in his kingdom and home. His word was law, unchallenged, unquestioned, but when his beloved son, Prince Hamdan, married a common girl, Hina, for love, the walls of the palace trembled. In the royal court, the chief minister stepped forward, bowing slightly. Your Majesty, this marriage does not align with the honor and stature of the throne. King Mohammed's gaze hardened. A prince's decisions should serve the kingdom's purpose, not his personal desires. A royal decree was issued. Prince Hamdan was to appear before the king in the grand hall, the prince or a lover. Prince Hamdan was a man of firm resolve, yet his heart was as deep as the desert night. He loved his kingdom, but he also loved Hina with an undying passion. When summoned to the grand hall, he knew a judgment awaited him. Seated on his gilded throne, King Mohammed was flanked by the Queen Mother, Amira. She remained silent, her expression unreadable. A single envelope lay on the table before him. The king's voice was unwavering. Sign this. Divorce her. Hamdan stared at the envelope, then met his father's gaze. If this is a king's command, I refuse. But if it is my father's wish, I may consider it. King Mohammed's expression turned to stone. A king and a father are one and the same. Will you defy me? Hamdan took a slow breath. If I sign this, will it truly bring you peace? The king's voice was sharp. Your marriage was a mistake. A prince does not marry for love, he marries for legacy. For the first time, Hamdan looked toward his mother. She remained silent, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Then, Prince Hamdan stood. If my wife is beneath this kingdom, then I do not need this kingdom. The king's fists clenched. His voice echoed through the hall. If you choose her, you must leave this throne behind. A breathless silence fell.
Every court member held their breath. Would the prince abandon his crown for love? Hamdan's lips curved slightly. If I am only a prince, I will obey. But if I am a man, I cannot forsake my love. King Mohammed's grip tightened on his throne's armrest. The queen inhaled sharply, while the royal court stood in stunned silence. But this was only the beginning of the storm. The prince's love or the king's command? Part 2. A thunderous silence settled in the grand hall. The air between father and son crackled with tension, as if the very walls of the palace braced for the storm that was about to strike. King Mohammed rose from his throne, his robes sweeping the marble floor like the tides of an unrelenting sea. You dare challenge me? His voice was deep, filled with the power of a ruler who had never been defied. Prince Hamdan's stance remained firm, his shoulders squared, his gaze unwavering. I do not challenge my king. I refuse my father's cruelty. The words were like an arrow to the king's pride. A sharp breath hissed through his teeth before his fury exploded. You arrogant child. The king roared. I built this empire with blood and iron. You think you can disgrace it with some meaningless love? Hamdan's jaw clenched. Love is never meaningless, father. The king's eyes darkened. He took a step forward, his hands curling into fists. Then fight for it. Before Hamdan could react, his father lunged at him. The clash of titans, the hall erupted into chaos as King Mohammed threw the first strike. A powerful, open-palmed blow aimed straight at Hamdan's face. But the prince, trained since childhood, anticipated it. He ducked, pivoting to the side just as the king's strike cut through the air. Guards instinctively stepped forward, but a glare from the queen froze them in place. This was not just a battle of fists. It was a war of will. Hamdan retaliated. His fist shot forward, slamming into his father's ribs. The king staggered but didn't fall. Instead, his lips curled into a dangerous smirk. Good. You are my son after all. He struck again, this time a brutal punch to Hamdan's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. The prince gasped but caught his father's wrist before the next blow could land. With a swift movement, he twisted the king's arm and forced him back. The king's face burned with rage. You think strength is enough to defy me? With a mighty push, he sent Hamdan crashing into the council table, shattering fine glass and golden goblets. Blood trickled from the prince's brow, but he wiped it away and stood tall once more. Hamdan's breathing was heavy. "I think strength is knowing when to walk away." The king let out a growl of pure fury and charged. The two clashed in a whirlwind of fists and grapples, a father wielding years of dominance against a son who had finally broken his chains. Each punch echoed through the halls, like war drums announcing a great battle. The queen gasped as the king caught Hamdan's jaw with a fierce uppercut, sending him sprawling to the ground. But Hamdan wasn't finished. He rolled, sprang to his feet, and unleashed a strike so powerful it sent the king stumbling back. For the first time in his reign, King Muhammad faltered. Breathing heavily, he steadied himself. His face was bruised, his robes torn, his crown slightly tilted. But what truly unsettled him was the look in Hamdan's eyes: defiance. Not rebellion. Strength, not disrespect. Silence fell again, thick and suffocating. Then, in a low voice, King Muhammad spoke. "Leave. Before I forget that you are my son." Hamdan wiped the blood from his lip. His body ached, his heart pounded, but he stood victorious in his own way. "I was never just your son," he said, voice calm yet cutting. "I am a man. And a man chooses his own fate." With that, he turned his back on the throne, on the kingdom, on the father who refused to understand. He walked toward the great doors of the palace. The prince's love or the king's command? Part 3. The massive golden doors of the palace loomed ahead as Prince Hamdan took slow, deliberate steps toward them. His body ached from the fight, his mind was heavy, but his heart was unshaken. Behind him, King Muhammad stood tall, but there was something in his posture, a rare hesitation, a silent war within. He had never lost before. The guards at the entrance stiffened, their hands twitching over their weapons. "Should we stop him, Your Majesty?" one of them dared to ask. The king clenched his jaw. His lips parted as if to say the word, but no sound came. He watched as his son, bloodied but unbroken, reached the doors and pushed them open. With a final look over his shoulder, Hamdan met his father's eyes. "You can command a kingdom, but you cannot command my heart." And with that, he stepped out. The heavy doors groaned as they shut behind him. The entire court remained silent, the weight of the moment suffocating. The queen's breath hitched, her fingers trembling as she reached for her husband's sleeve. "What have you done?" she whispered, but the king did not answer. His eyes remained on the doors, his fists clenched at his sides, because deep inside, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had won or lost. A kingdom without a prince. For days, the palace halls felt emptier. Servants whispered in corners. Ministers avoided speaking of the incident. The people of the kingdom were beginning to ask, "Where is the prince?" Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the prince had fled to another land. Others claimed he had been secretly imprisoned. A few even dared to suggest he was gathering an army to return and overthrow the king. But the truth was simpler, and far more dangerous. Prince Hamdan was still in the city, living among the people, without his title, without his guards, without the riches of the palace. And for the first time in his life, he was free.